The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, right in the middle of my board meeting with the senior partners at Meridian Capital Group. I glanced at my phone and saw Dad on the caller ID. My first instinct was to decline the call. I was in the middle of discussing a $340 million acquisition deal, but something made me answer. "Excuse me for just one moment," I told the board members, then accepted the call. "Hi, Dad." "Jessica." His voice was cold, formal, the way he spoke to employees he was about to fire. "I'm calling to inform you that your living situation needs to change immediately." I frowned, stepping away from the conference table. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Manhattan office, I could see the bustling streets 40 stories below. "What are you talking about? Pack your bags, you're out tomorrow. This is our house now, and we've decided we don't want you living here anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. I was 32 years old, successful beyond my father's wildest dreams, and he was kicking me out of a house I hadn't lived in for over 8 years. "Dad, I don't live with you. I haven't lived with you since I moved to New York for college. Don't play dumb with me, Jessica. Your mother and I are tired of supporting a deadbeat daughter who can't get her life together. We're selling the house and we don't want you coming around anymore looking for handouts." I could hear my stepmother Karen in the background, her voice shrill with satisfaction. "Tell her about the credit cards, Robert. Tell her we're cutting off all the credit cards too." My father was on speakerphone. Of course he was. This wasn't a private conversation between father and daughter. This was a public execution, performed for Karen's entertainment. "You heard her," Dad continued. "We're canceling your credit cards, cutting off your allowance, and we don't want to see you at family gatherings anymore. You're 32 years old, Jessica. It's time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet instead of living off your family's success." I looked around the conference room where I'd been sitting just moments before. The senior partners of one of Wall Street's most prestigious investment firms were waiting for me to return so we could finalize a deal that would net my company over $50 million in fees. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. "I understand," I said calmly. "But Dad, before you hang up, could you do me a favor and check your email? I just sent you something important." "I don't have time for your games, Jessica. I'm busy running a real business, not playing around with whatever silly little hobby you call work. Just check your email. Please. It'll only take 30 seconds. I could hear him grumbling, but after a moment the sound of typing came through the speaker. Then silence. Long, heavy silence. "Robert." Karen's voice cut through the quiet. "What is it? What's wrong?" When my father spoke again, his voice was completely different. Gone was the cold authority, replaced by something that sounded like panic. "Jessica, what is this?" "What's what, Dad?" "This email. It says you own Hartwell Manufacturing." I smiled even though he couldn't see me. "Not all of it. Just 80%. The silence that followed was deafening. I could picture my father's face, the way his confidence would be cracking as he tried to process what he was seeing. Hartwell Manufacturing wasn't just any company, it was his company. The business he'd built from nothing, the source of his pride and identity, his legacy. Or so he thought. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You're lying. This is some kind of fake document. Check the letterhead, Dad. That's from Morrison Klein and Associates. They're the law firm that handled the acquisition. Would you like me to have them call you directly to confirm?" "Acquisition?" Karen's voice was shrill now. "What acquisition? Robert, what is she talking about?" I could hear papers rustling, the frantic clicking of a computer mouse. My father was checking, verifying, desperately hoping that what he was seeing wasn't real. It was very real. "Jessica." His voice was barely audible. How is this possible?" "It's a long story, Dad. Maybe we should discuss it in person." "Oh, but first, didn't you just tell me I wasn't welcome at family gatherings anymore? I'm a little confused about the protocol here." The line went dead. 30 seconds later my phone rang again. Same caller ID, but this time when I answered, my father's voice was completely different. Scared, desperate, pleading. "Jessica, please. We need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding. Karen and we didn't mean what we said. We were worried about you, that's all. We thought some tough love might motivate you to." "To what, Dad? To stop being a deadbeat? To get my life together? To learn to stand on my own 2 feet? We didn't know. We had no idea that you had. That I had what?" A real job? A successful career? The ability to acquire your entire company without you even noticing. I walked back toward the conference room where my colleagues were waiting patiently. These people, my real family, the ones who had supported my ambitions and celebrated my successes, knew exactly who Jessica Martinez was and what she was capable of. Unlike my biological family, who still saw me as the struggling college graduate who couldn't find her place in the world. "We need to meet," Dad said urgently. "Tonight. Can you come to the house? We need to discuss this situation." I thought I wasn't welcome at the house anymore. "Jessica, please. Don't do this. Whatever game you're playing. This isn't a game, Dad. This is business. And business hours are 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. You can call my office tomorrow to schedule an appointment." "Your office?" "Meridian Capital Group. 42nd floor, Manhattan. My assistant's name is Patricia. She'll fit you in somewhere between my other meetings." I hung up and returned to the conference room, sliding smoothly back into CEO mode. Sorry about that interruption. Now, where were we on the Patterson Industries deal? But even as I focused on the business at hand, my mind was racing with memories. 3 years of memories that my family knew nothing about. 3 years ago, I had been exactly what my father thought I was, a struggling recent graduate with a business degree and big dreams but no clear path forward. I'd been living in a tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn, working as a junior analyst at a small investment firm, barely making enough to cover rent and student loans. My family had written me off as a disappointment. Dad made no secret of his belief that I lacked the drive and intelligence to succeed in business. "You're too soft," he'd tell me during our awkward family dinners. "Business isn't about being nice. It's about being smart and ruthless. You don't have what it takes." Karen, my stepmother, was even more direct. "Some people are just meant to be employees, not employers," she'd say with a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "There's nothing wrong with that, Jessica. Not everyone can be a leader." They'd offered to give me a job at Hartwell Manufacturing, a low-level position in the accounting department, working under Karen's supervision. "You could learn the business from the ground up," Dad had said. "Maybe someday you could work your way up to management." The offer was humiliating, but I'd seriously considered it. I was tired of struggling, tired of living paycheck to paycheck, tired of feeling like a failure every time I called home. But then I met Marcus Chin. Marcus was a senior partner at a mid-size investment firm who'd noticed my analysis work on a small tech acquisition. "You have good instincts," he told me over coffee. "But you're thinking too small. If you really want to understand how business works, you need to study the big players." He'd offered me a position at his firm, not a prestigious job, but one that would give me access to major deals, major players, and major learning opportunities. More importantly, he'd offered me mentorship. "I'll teach you everything I know," Marcus had promised. "But only if you're willing to work harder than you've ever worked in your life." I'd taken the job. And for the next 3 years I'd done exactly what Marcus suggested. I'd worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life. 18-hour days became normal. I studied every deal that crossed my desk, analyzed every company we considered acquiring, and slowly began to understand how the investment world really worked. I learned about leverage, about timing, about the art of identifying undervalued assets and the science of turning struggling companies into profitable ones. I also learned about patience. While my family continued to see me as a failure, I was quietly building relationships with investors, learning from successful entrepreneurs, and developing the skills that would eventually make me one of the youngest partners in Meridian Capital Group's history. But most importantly, I was watching my father's company. Hartwell Manufacturing had always been Dad's pride and joy. He'd started it 25 years ago with a small loan and a big dream, building it into a moderately successful business that specialized in precision industrial components. It wasn't a huge company, about 200 employees and $50 million in annual revenue, but it was profitable and stable. Or it had been until Karen convinced Dad to expand. Over the past 2 years, Karen had pushed for aggressive growth. New product lines, new markets, new facilities. Dad, who had always been conservative in his business approach, had been swept up in her vision of building an empire. The expansion had been a disaster. New product lines failed to find markets. New facilities sat half empty. New equipment purchased with borrowed money generated mounting debt payments that the company couldn't afford. Within 18 months, Hartwell Manufacturing had gone from profitable to struggling to desperate. Dad had managed to hide the company's financial troubles from most people, but he couldn't hide them from someone who knew how to read between the lines of financial statements. And as someone with access to commercial credit reports and industry analysis tools, I'd been watching the company's decline with growing concern. Not concern for Dad's ego or his legacy, but concern for the 200 employees who depended on Hartwell Manufacturing for their livelihoods. Good people who had worked hard and loyally for my father, who didn't deserve to lose their jobs because of his poor business decisions. So 6 months ago I'd made an offer. Not directly, of course. Dad's pride would never have allowed him to accept help from his failure daughter. Instead, I'd structured the deal through a web of subsidiary companies and silent partnerships that obscured my involvement. On paper, it looked like a consortium of investors had purchased 80% of Hartwell Manufacturing in exchange for assuming the company's debt and providing working capital for restructuring. Dad retained 20% ownership and stayed on as CEO, but with limited decision-making authority. In reality, I owned 80% of my father's company, and had spent the past 6 months quietly fixing the mess he and Karen had created. The failed product lines were discontinued. The excess facilities were sold or leased to other companies. The expensive, underutilized equipment was either put to better use or sold to reduce debt. Most importantly, the company was refocused on what it had always done best, producing high-quality precision components for a specific set of customers. The turnaround had been successful. Hartwell Manufacturing was profitable again, the employees' jobs were secure, and the company was positioned for sustainable growth. Dad thought he'd accomplished this turnaround himself. He had no idea that every major decision of the past 6 months had been guided by recommendations from the consulting firm that the new investors had insisted on hiring. He had no idea that the consulting firm was another subsidiary of my company. He had no idea that his business recovery was actually his daughter's business recovery. Until today. My assistant Patricia knocked on my office door around 6 p.m. "Ms. Martinez? Your father is here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent." I looked up from the financial reports I'd been reviewing, ironically, Hartwell Manufacturing's quarterly numbers, which were looking better than they had in 2 years. "Send him in." Dad walked into my office looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 4 hours. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his tie was crooked, and his eyes had the slightly wild look of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. He stopped just inside the door, staring around at my office with obvious amazement. The space was large and elegant, with a view of Central Park and furnishings that clearly indicated serious success. Awards and recognition plaques lined one wall. Photos of me with prominent business leaders adorned another. "Jesus, Jessica," he whispered. "This is really your office." "It is. Please have a seat." He sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs across from my desk, still looking around in bewilderment. How long have you been successful?" "About 3 years now. I made partner 18 months ago. I've been the lead on acquisitions worth about $2.8 billion since I started here." Billion. He was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "And Hartwell, you really own 80% of my company?" "I do." "Why?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Why had I saved his company? Why had I hidden my involvement? Why had I let him believe he was managing his own recovery? "Because 200 people depended on that company for their jobs," I said simply. Good people who didn't deserve to suffer because of poor management decisions. The words hit him like a slap. Poor management decisions? I built that company from nothing. You did. And it was impressive. But Dad, you also nearly destroyed it over the past 2 years. The expansion into automotive components was a mistake. You didn't have the expertise or the market connections to compete. The new facility in Ohio was poorly located and overly expensive. The equipment purchases were financed at terrible rates because the company's credit rating had already started to decline. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. "How do you know all that?" "Because it's my job to know. When I evaluate companies for acquisition, I look at everything: market position, financial health, management competence, growth potential. Hartwell Manufacturing was a textbook case of a good business being run into the ground by inexperienced leadership making emotional decisions instead of data-driven ones. Emotional decisions? Dad, you expanded into automotive components because Karen's brother works in that industry and convinced you it was easy money. You chose the Ohio location because Karen wanted to be closer to her family. You financed the equipment purchases through her cousin's lending company instead of shopping for better rates. Every major decision of the past 2 years was influenced by Karen's opinions rather than business analysis. His face was getting redder with each word. Karen was trying to help. She had ideas. Karen had opinions. There's a difference. And her opinions nearly cost 200 people their jobs. So you bought my company to save it from me? I leaned back in my chair, choosing my words carefully. I bought your company because it was a good investment opportunity. The underlying business was sound, the market position was strong, and the problems were fixable. The fact that saving it would also save your legacy and protect your employees' jobs was a bonus. And you let me think I was managing the recovery myself. You were managing the day-to-day operations. You just weren't making the strategic decisions anymore. He was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the darkening Manhattan skyline. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and defeated. I feel like an idiot. You shouldn't. Building a business from nothing is incredibly difficult. Most people never manage to do what you did with Hartwell Manufacturing. The fact that you made some mistakes during the expansion doesn't negate 23 years of success. But my own daughter had to save me. My daughter, who I thought was a failure. Dad, I was never a failure. I was just getting started. He looked at me, then really looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. When did you become so successful, professional, competent? I was going to say intimidating. I smiled at that. Probably around the same time you started treating me like a disappointment instead of a daughter. That hit home. I could see it in his face, the recognition of the distance that had grown between us, the realization that his assumptions about my life had been completely wrong. Jessica, I owe you an apology. A huge apology. The things I said today, the way I've treated you, I had no idea. That I was successful? Dad, my success doesn't change the way you treated me. If I really had been struggling, if I really had been living in your basement and depending on family handouts, would that have justified kicking me out via speakerphone? Would it have been okay to humiliate me like that if I really was a failure? He looked ashamed. No, it wouldn't have been okay. Then don't apologize for not knowing about my success. Apologize for treating your daughter badly regardless of her circumstances. You're right. He took a deep breath. I'm sorry, Jessica. I'm sorry for dismissing your dreams, for assuming you couldn't succeed, for letting Karen influence how I treated you. I'm sorry for today, and I'm sorry for the past 3 years of being a terrible father. It was a start. Not enough to undo years of disappointment and dismissal, but a start. What happens now? He asked. With the company, I mean. Are you going to fire me? Replace me with professional management? I'd been thinking about that question for months. That depends on you. The company is stable now, but it needs consistent leadership focused on sustainable growth rather than emotional expansion. Can you provide that? I think so. I hope so. I've learned a lot over the past 6 months working with the consulting firm. Good. Then here's what's going to happen. You'll continue as CEO, but with a board of directors that has real oversight authority. No major decisions without board approval. No expansion plans without thorough market analysis and financial modeling. No hiring family members or friends without proper qualifications. And Karen? That was the big question. Karen had been the driving force behind most of the company's problems, but she was also Dad's wife. Karen is no longer involved in any business decisions. If she wants to maintain an office at the company, fine, but she has no operational authority. Dad nodded slowly. She's not going to like that. Dad, Karen nearly destroyed your company and cost 200 people their jobs. Whether she likes the new arrangement is irrelevant. You're right. Again. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the new reality of our relationship. I was no longer his struggling daughter hoping for approval and support. He was no longer the successful father I looked up to for guidance and wisdom. We were equals now. Business equals, family equals in every way that mattered. There's one more thing, I said. The house. What about it? Are you really selling it? Karen and I discussed it. We thought we might downsize, use the equity to pay off some personal debts. I pulled a folder from my desk drawer and slid it across to him. Those are the personal debts you're referring to, right? Dad opened the folder and his face went pale. Inside were copies of credit card statements, loan documents, and other financial records showing the extent of his and Karen's personal spending over the past 2 years. How did you? Credit reports are public information if you know how to access them. Dad, you and Karen have racked up over $400,000 in personal debt. Credit cards, personal loans, a second mortgage on the house. You've been using the house as collateral for lifestyle spending. The business was struggling. We thought if we could just maintain appearances until things turned around. So you borrowed against the house to keep up with country club memberships and luxury vacations while your company was failing? He couldn't meet my eyes. When you put it like that, it sounds terrible. It is terrible, Dad. It's exactly the kind of emotional, short-sighted decision-making that nearly destroyed your business. So what do you suggest? I pulled out another folder. I suggest you accept my offer to buy the house. You want to buy my house? I want to buy a house. Your house happens to be available and I have childhood memories there that make it worth preserving. I'm offering you full market value, enough to pay off all your debts and leave you with a substantial cash cushion. Dad stared at the purchase offer, his hands shaking slightly. This is very generous. It's fair market value. Nothing more, nothing less. But where would Karen and I live? There's a nice townhouse community about 20 minutes away. Smaller homes but still upscale. Much more appropriate for your actual income level rather than the lifestyle you've been trying to maintain. It was a diplomatic way of saying that he and Karen needed to learn to live within their means instead of borrowing against the future to fund a lifestyle they couldn't afford. Jessica, I don't know what to say. You're saving the company, buying the house, fixing our financial problems. Why? After the way we've treated you, why are you helping us? I thought about that question carefully. Because you're my father. And despite everything that's happened between us, I don't want to see you lose everything you've worked for. But Dad, this is the last time. I'm not going to keep rescuing you from poor decisions. This is your chance to start over, to build a sustainable life based on reality instead of wishful thinking. And if we mess up again? Then you deal with the consequences yourself. I'm your daughter, not your safety net. He nodded, understanding the terms of this new relationship. What about Karen? She's going to have a hard time adjusting to all of this. Karen's adjustment is between you and her. But Dad, you need to understand something. Karen's influence on your business decisions nearly cost you everything. If you want to maintain a relationship with me going forward, you need to make sure that never happens again. You're asking me to choose between my wife and my daughter. I'm asking you to choose between emotional decision-making and rational decision-making. If Karen can learn to support rational decisions, then there's no conflict. If she can't, I shrugged. Then you'll have to decide what's more important to you. Dad left my office that evening with a lot to think about. Purchase agreements to review, personal finances to reorganize, and some difficult conversations to have with his wife. But most importantly, he left with a new understanding of who his daughter really was. Over the next few weeks, the transition went more smoothly than I'd expected. Dad signed the house purchase agreement and used the proceeds to pay off his debts. He and Karen moved into a modest townhouse that fit their actual income. The company continued its recovery under the new board structure. Karen, predictably, was furious about losing her influence over business decisions. She blamed me for humiliating Dad and destroying the family. But Dad, to his credit, stood firm on the new boundaries. Jessica saved our company and our financial future, he told Karen during one particularly heated argument that I overheard during a business call. If you can't accept that and treat her with respect, then you and I are going to have problems. It was the first time I'd ever heard Dad stand up to Karen. It was also the first time I'd felt truly proud of him in years. 6 months later, Hartwell Manufacturing's recovery was complete. The company was profitable, growing sustainably, and providing secure employment for all 200 workers. Dad had proven himself capable of managing the business under the new structure, and the board had gained confidence in his leadership. More importantly, Dad and I had begun rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than his assumptions about my capabilities. We had dinner once a month now. Just the two of us, no Karen, no business discussions, just father and daughter getting to know each other as adults. He told me stories about building his business that I'd never heard before. I told him about my work, my goals, my life in New York that he'd never bothered to ask about. It wasn't the relationship we'd had when I was young, but it was better. It was honest. During one of our dinners, he asked me the question I'd been expecting. Do you forgive me, Jessica? For the way I treated you, for the assumptions I made, for not believing in you. I thought about it for a moment. I forgive you for being human, Dad. I forgive you for making mistakes and letting your pride get in the way of seeing who I really was. But I don't forgive the years of dismissal and disrespect. Those are just part of our history now. Fair enough, he said. And going forward? Going forward, we build something new. Something based on who we really are instead of who we thought each other was. He raised his glass of wine. To new beginnings. To new beginnings, I agreed. As I drove home to the house where I'd grown up, my house now filled with new memories to replace the painful ones, I reflected on how much had changed since that phone call 6 months ago. Dad had learned that success comes in many forms, and that his definition of achievement was far too narrow. I'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply living well and letting the truth speak for itself. But most importantly, we'd both learned that family relationships, like business relationships, require mutual respect to survive. Love alone isn't enough if it's not accompanied by genuine regard for each other's capabilities and choices. The scared, insecure young woman who'd once desperately wanted her father's approval was gone. In her place was a confident, successful business leader who knew her own worth and wouldn't settle for relationships that required her to diminish herself. Dad had a choice. Accept who I really was and build a relationship based on equality and respect, or continue living in a fantasy where I was still the struggling daughter who needed his guidance and support. He'd made the right choice. And for the first time in years, I was genuinely proud to be his daughter. The house felt different now that it was mine. Not just because I owned it, but because I'd claimed my place in the family story. No longer the disappointing daughter who couldn't measure up, but the successful businesswoman who'd saved her father's legacy and given him a second chance. It was a better story. And finally, it was true.